and then I got talking with people, and I came in, and Scott had already started talking, so I let it roll. Um, One thing is, I'm not sure if maybe you've heard of the 23andMe bankruptcy. That's kind of made the news a little bit, in which people that judiciously decided to send their samples of their genetic structure onto a corporate entity, uh, then now 23andMe is going bankrupt, and who knows who that that information may be of value to some people. So if you're concerned about that, and if you've participated in that 23andMe, you may well be advised to go onto their website and you can delete your information. It could be sold to an insurance company who decides what your insurance rates should be, or it could be a lot of different things could potentially happen. So I thought that was worth mentioning. Let's see. This is a little bit dated, but along with a lot of other stuff that went on this weekend, protests in Chicago and all over the country, hundreds of thousands of people. So that's pretty interesting to me. That RFK forced out Peter Marks, who's the FDA's top vaccine scientist. He was very much involved in the what did they call it again? I had it in my mind and forgot it. The push to develop the vaccine so quickly. Warp speed, right, warp speed. He was like the head guy making that happen, and somehow RFK asked for his, that he would resign or he would be fired. And so in his note he said that he mentioned that there was an effort, and RFK sought a subservient confirmation of his misinformation and bias. So that's, he went out with a little bit of a blaze of glory and so on too. But so that's of interest and importance, that top scientists that have done things that have moved us along are now being pushed out of the administration. Kind of related to that, the use of AI, Elon Musk says that his Doge group will rewrite the entire Social Security code in something like 2 years. It's been written in COBOL back in the 50s or 60s, I think, the existing one, and they don't even understand COBOL, which is some of the reasons why some of the decisions that were made talking about people that were 220 years old and still on the Social Security list. That's because COBOL assigns a weird date to people if you don't know a date. And I'm pretty sure that even though it ended up in a speech before Congress and so on, that there aren't 220-year-olds getting Social Security. And so to me, the use of AI and using that to write a code that's going to do things, it's going to be a mess, in my opinion. All right. Also, all the cuts. I know when President Trump was running for office, he was going to unleash the power of American innovation, is what he said. And that was going to stop all these issues of, it was going to cure, he had specifically talked about curing cancer and curing Alzheimer's and things like that. And now it seems like a lot of that stuff is falling on the wayside because this Doge money, yeah, it's just, yeah. So pretty amazing. If you can't have basis to work on, right? You get rid of the heads of the FDA and the vaccine cures and vaccine development and so on, and get rid of all the money and funding and so on. So I'm impressed. I think a lot of people here are doing what they can to complain and talk about that as well too. So I think 2 weeks from now, Scott's going to be talking about spring and magnolias. It's right on Easter Day, I believe, right? And we've had a lot of fun with Easter Day here that talked about resurrection science and bringing things back to life. And there is a great part of spring and Easter that's celebrating bringing things back to life. We've talked about the spring toads in Africa, and we've talked about zombie science and so on. And magnolias is another aspect of spring that Scott will talk about here, the wonders of spring. And then 4 weeks from now, I'm in discussions with Pat Burke, who's sitting here, and she and the Green Sanctuary are looking to do a story about food sourcing. And can you fill me in a little bit more?
Well, hopefully we'll be able to do it by that date. It's regarding choices we can make with the way we buy food and cook food. The choices we can make.
Didn't sound like it was, huh?
Choices we can make with the way we buy food and cook food that might be small choices or might be major changes, all the way down from explaining, based on recent research of the environmental costs, particularly to the climate, of things like farming and which products have the most impact in farm making, in animal husbandry, fishing, and so forth, but also the way we prepare food at home. We'll take the whole gamut of anything having to do with food and try to give the best information available on its environmental impact.
I bet you'll be able to fill an hour. Good. And then after that will be mid-May, and we will have our last Science Sunday because we take a break through the summertime generally. And that will be a call for information. People who want to do the Science Slam that we've done each year. And that's been a lot of fun. A lot of people I've seen in the audience have participated and done stuff with it, and it's been great. So start thinking if you can do something again. I thought last year's just kind of came up, and it's nice to see just something kind of endemically just rise up and be so much fun. So we had a good time with it, and hopefully that we can see some science and some talk individually about that. So Science Slam on the third Sunday in May. All right? I wanted to talk about science and engineering. Some of this got started because I was listening to Scott, and he was talking about this asymptotic approach toward perfection or towards full knowledge of things. And you know, that seems like definitely a scientific goal. He was talking about, you know, the more and more we learn about things. Newton found certain things about gravity, and then it went on further and further, and Einstein came up with insights and so on too. And we still don't have the full understanding of gravity and life and how that happens. But part of that seems to me to be something that scientists are going at. And it's also an aspect that engineers go at too. So I was kind of thinking about the comparison of that. And then I found this book. I don't know if any of you have heard this guy, Bill Hammack. He's called The Engineer Guy. And he's got really interesting websites, and he does demonstrations and so on. And he talks about how engineering is helping the world and what it's done and so on too. So I was actually thinking prior to try to do an explanation of how we get color TV. And I got into so many topics about that. It's like, nah, I don't think I'm ready to present that at all. But then looking in the engineering section of the library, I found this book. And I really recommend getting onto his website if you can. Bill Hammack, Hammack, almost like hammock. And he does really interesting things. And some of this is based on that. But are there any people that would say they're scientists here today? Okay. Any engineers? People would say they're engineers? Ah, okay, good. We got them outnumbered, I think, maybe. So I'm very interested to hear your comments as we go through this and talk about it too. If you can, look up his videos. He actually won the Carl Sagan. He was a Carl Sagan Award winner for his bringing science and engineering to people in the natural world and understanding it and so on. So he's won a lot of awards. Interesting guy. Went to the University of Illinois in Champaign as well, too. So if you'd have to define engineering, can anyone say, there's kind of a common phrase that they say, what is engineering? Thems that do? Okay. Practical science. I've heard a lot applied science, right? You apply science. And this guy's kind of pushing back on that, and we'll explore a little bit of that concept for a while too. And like I said, I'm building off Scott's view of knowledge is an asymptotic approach towards perfection, is what you said, Scott. A perfect description of reality. Right. Faraday wanted to explore and explain electricity, right? He was a scientist exploring and explaining what happens and so on. They're searching for truth and knowledge. Einstein wanted to explore and explain the universe and things that went on with light bending and different things like that too, and gravity. But then people, sometimes engineers in some cases, use these tools and the common sense that were developed by people and their common sense and rules of thumb to solve real-world problems. There's a great amount of give and take as we explore and attempt to better live in our world. So that's kind of the area I want to look at a little bit. If we base it on that, I'm trying to say that there's differing goals between a scientist and an engineer. The scientific method is aimed to reveal basic truths about the universe. Its whole goal is to develop those truths and to explore them and to dig deep down into them. There's really a prescribed process for scientists. We know we were taught that in 5th grade science. I think a lot of us stood, and listened to these things. State a question, observe it, develop a hypothesis, test it, analyze it, and interpret the results. Okay? But engineering's been around for a long time too. Is this in the way?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you. The engineering method.
A scientist doing engineering.
Yeah. Thanks for the scientist. We needed the scientist to do that. The engineering method seeks solutions to real-world situations. It aims for a specific goal, but there's no real prescribed process. You find a specific strategy that'll help you reach a certain goal. Okay? Some of that are the tools you use. You may use scientific thought or scientific explanations. You may use a lot of other aspects of ways to do it. But imagine, engineering was around when people decided how to build the first rafts, right, to float on the water and to fish from. And then as they developed boats that were better and more suited for what they needed to use the boats for. And bridges, right? And then it went on to a lot of other things. So here's kind of a common way of engineers tend to look at it. Engineers say if it's a success, then it's always classified as a scientific miracle. If it's a disaster, then it's an engineering failure. So we, living nowadays, think of our furnace or airplanes or road signage or pop cans or almost anything only when they fail, right? We just take them for granted and we live our life and enjoy the fruits that we get from each of those benefits, right? But if they fail, some engineer screwed up, right? And we can think of all of them actually as a success. I know I work a lot with tool making to make cans, and if you go in a can plant, I was in a can plant this last week, they make 5 million cans a day. 5 million, okay? And they use our tools to do it, so they're not very happy if your tool isn't working and it stops their line. And then it's an engineering failure. So to use that as an example, if you look at pop containers, some facts about it, 72% of the cost of a can is just for the metal it takes to make the can, right? You've seen metal getting thinner and thinner and thinner in pop cans and beer cans and so on in the last while. They do a lot of things to save metal. If you look at a Campbell soup can, it has all the beads on the sides of it that makes it stronger and stronger. Pop cans don't need it because it's pressurized inside, right? And they provide their own pressure. But once you pull the top on a pop can, yeah, it can go. So any way that you can save material saves a lot of money. When you make 5 million cans a day, if you can save a portion of that 72% of the cost of the metal, you're saving millions and millions of dollars in a year, okay? That's why they want us to make closer and closer tolerance tools. They want them to last longer, all these different things. Something like 25% of the cost of a can is the facility that they build, the employees pay and their benefits and things like that. And something like 2% of the cost of a can is the tooling that they buy to put in it. So I put my 4 kids through college and bought my house and do everything on 2% of the cost of a can. So you have to be an engineer to be able to do that, I'd say. So customers want a convenient container to hold their main goal, which is cool soda pop, right? So these are different things. But if you think of that, what is the most efficient use of material to get the most pop using the least metal? If they can do that, then they're saving a lot of money, right? If they can save 2% of the cost of the material, if they can save 4%, what's the most efficient way to get the most liquid inside a container? A sphere. A sphere. So if you'd make a sphere and you'd sell pop in a sphere, you'd be saving a lot of money as a pop maker, right? You'd probably save money, or you'd probably get money more anyways, because imagine somebody put the pop down on the table and it'll tip over, right? So you can't always use, as a scientist would say, make it out of a sphere, right? But an engineer has to take other things into account too and say, I don't think they'll want it rolling over when it sits on the table. There's other things about it as well too. There's something that's not right about a sphere in terms of saving. Shipping. You have a sphere next to a sphere next to a sphere and a sphere on top of a sphere. There's a lot of gaps, a lot of air gaps in between, right? What's actually the most effective way to save space for shipping? A cube or a rectoid, right? Yeah. Again, you could put them side by side by side, top on bottom, all there that way. That would be the most efficient way to ship it, and there might be savings that way. An engineer has to do that. What are the weaknesses of having something made out of a rectangle like that, a cube? Sharp corners. Can you imagine making a can with sharp corners like that, Chris? Doesn't handle the pressure, and pressure is different in different ways, right? You'd have to make it probably a lot thicker, right, to just make it able to share that, to withstand that pressure, right? Greater surface area. Not fun to hold a rectangle and drink from it, right? Not easy. So all those things come in, and there's a balance, right? There's a trade-off. We'll talk more about trade-offs and so on too. So there are many different ways to use material, but other considerations there are in making a container for pop. There's a lot of issues to come up with that. What do you gain by the pop can the way it is nowadays? What's good about that? Pardon me? Convenient to hold, right? Pardon me? Stable, doesn't break. The pressures are fairly consistent. Actually, there's more metal in the bottom of a pop can than there is in the whole rest of the can, right? Well, the top, not counting the top, yeah. Recyclable. So all those are aspects that have to be balanced together and to say what makes it, well, shipping is pretty easy when you have something like this. They ship pretty well. It's easy to make the circular tops for cans. They actually make them staggered. So they make a row, maybe 13 can ends here, and then they stagger it half the thing, and they have another punches making the next 12, let's say. So you can get 25 and without much waste. And the other thing you've probably seen is how they've necked in the top of beer and pop cans too. Because instead of using a can end that's this big, you can use one that's this big, and you can fit maybe 20% more ends in there with much less space as you're blanking out all these ends. If you're blanking 5 million ends a day, if you can save the cost of that, save 20% of the cost of that, you're doing some good. So all those are aspects. I thought I'd say this is maybe I think we all agreed that this is probably the perfect thing then, right? The whole pull top on cans is a whole big thing. Some of us were around when you needed a church key to open up all the cans, right? That was the big thing. And then it went to be the pull-off tops, and how many people stepped on that at the beach? Yeah. They were always pulled off at the beach and thrown in the sand, and then we'd come along as 8-year-olds and step on it. And then they went to the easy open top, and they've made a lot of changes in that. Those were developed in Dayton, Ohio, by a company called Dayton Reliable, and we do some work for them at times. But, yeah. So interesting thing. Just the engineering behind a pop can is just phenomenal. And they're doing it with less and less engineers nowadays, too. They're cutting money, they're not wanting to spend it, you know, and they're all kind of trying to save money by just perfecting, making the tool maker's job harder, make it tighter and tighter and tighter tolerances. Here's some engineering that happened a little bit before the pop can, though. Development of a cathedral. This is Saint-Chapelle in Paris in the 13th century. There was some amazing engineering to go into something like that. They had really no knowledge at the time of geometry, geometrical theorems and proofs. They didn't know about hypotenuse and sine and cosine and so on. How do you make something like that? Before this, the Romans made round things, right? Have you been to Rome and seen the Pantheon? Big circular round thing, massive walls, very dark, right? The only way they could make it was they perfected concrete, but making these things as strong as possible and sturdy as possible, and the dome supports itself and so on. But the development of the Gothic arch was a fantastic development, started by the Arabs and perfected or moved along, let's say, in an engineering sense. By the 13th century, they were building this. This is right on the Isle la Cite, the island of the city that Notre Dame is on. This is within a quarter mile of Notre Dame, and another beautiful little chapel here right next to it, you know. And the effort, built around the same time. Notre Dame took a lot longer to build, but the effort, and you think, were they competing against each other? What were they doing? You know, did you leave work at one place because you messed up and you end up working at the other place or something? But
It seems like there was knowledge in the Middle Ages about what you could do, and it was just empiric knowledge, and they did it based on that rather than knowing the numbers and the mathematics of it.
yeah. Yeah, I have a little bit of a,
So they had an engineering knowledge that was not, that they couldn't explain in terms of physics.
right. Right. They had an engineering knowledge that didn't have a physics or a mathematical background to it.
That it was based on fact. Oh, sorry. Was it trial and error also?
Trial and error comes in a lot. We'll talk about trial and error in all this as well, too. And sometimes there's another word. Go ahead. Sorry.
If it worked yesterday, it'll work tomorrow.
That's true. Right. Right. The things that worked yesterday will probably work well tomorrow again, too. But this is also innovative, too, right? It probably wasn't the first Gothic arch that was ever built. There was simpler ones built, but they expanded on the knowledge that they had, right?
Some fell down before they figured out the details.
But when you think of the ones that are still there from the 13th century, the 1200s, right? That's 800 years that it's been standing, and many of them have been standing and part of it is that they developed rules of thumb. How do you make an arch? They kind of understood the concept, even not knowing the math of how it was done. And some of that is passed down in some of their writings, but these people were so talented, and the master masons and so on were like the heads of the job, and things were done. They didn't even have consistent measurements. The Saint-Chapelle was built to different measurements, and you can prove it by walking the floor and measuring things to a different measurement system than the Notre Dame, which was a quarter of a mile away from it, right? Because the master mason, maybe his inch or foot or with their measurement technique was based on his knuckle, and the others was based on the other master mason's knuckle, right? So you can see that you couldn't take a block from one and use it in the same way in the other cathedral. Yes?
It seems to me that in some situations, the physicists were making their rules based on what they empirically saw. So in some situations, man's creativity and engineering came first, and then people analyzed it to try to figure out the physics and the numbers associated with it, which is amazing that they could accomplish this without being able to, figure out the math, design it on a piece of paper with math, but that's, I think, a lot of human history. We've done things and then later on explained how it worked.
Right, right. Yeah, there's a different time frame. Behind you, Joanne? Right here?
So I just wanted to push back a little bit against the, oh, they didn't have math, because I mean, Euclidean geometry was around since ancient Greece, and if you look at the works of Vitruvius on architecture, it's all based on proportions. And so they were absolutely using numbers and using proportions of, oh, if it's this far across, then it needs to be this high, or that sort of thing. So it wasn't necessarily like, I'm going to sit down and calculate, but they were using tools like Abacai, they were using all those sorts of things to manage the reality of numbers, even if they weren't using the abstraction of numerals.
I would agree with that completely. I think that's true. I actually have one more here.
Sainte-Chapelle is also, I'm sorry, more coffee. Sainte-Chapelle is also interesting and important because that's one of the cathedrals they started building the flying buttresses in the structure, in contrast to the older Gothic cathedrals. And that would require some calculation, I think, not maybe the high-level calculation you're talking about, but certainly understanding proportion and relationships.
Balance, yeah.
Yeah, because it's really about balance and holding the walls up so they could be thinner and taller.
Yeah, yeah. And when they were almost in competition with each other, they wanted to make it lighter and more impressive than the one just a quarter of a mile away. Let me show you.
I might also add that recent archaeological work has shown that the Sumerians had worked out the Pythagorean theorem something around 4,000 to 5,000 BC. It's an extremely long and complicated piece of amazing work, but they had figured it all out. So when we say they don't use the math, yeah, they really did. And they had excellent rules of thumb, which, again, you've alluded to.
Right, rules of thumb, and some things were lost obviously in the Middle Ages
Yes.
as well, too.
Just one more thing.
Yeah.
A lot of engineering you learn from failures. I mean, you look at the airplane industry in particular, and the flying buttress we just mentioned was because things were falling down. And so you take it to the extreme and you learn things from it and you build upon that. So it is this progressive improvement in terms of knowledge until you get to like today where there's handbooks where you can look stuff up.
Right, yeah, so this progressive development of knowledge, compared to sometimes science has this flash of brilliance that comes out or something like that. You know, here's my explanation for, why electric motors can work, or here's my explanation for how Newton didn't understand certain aspects of gravity too. But yeah, there's some level of rooting it in common sense and common thought.
Yeah,
Let me
they
show you an
look at
example
the-
of what was done. I don't know, can you see it from here? Not well.
They put it up front.
All right. I'm not sure if they can hear me at home, but basically, there was, this is an arch that maybe, the best I can draw it, I'm an engineer that can't draw. That would be a template for what they wanted to build at the Sainte-Chapelle. And they basically, the rule of thumb that developed and that was used, and it's been recorded, is that they took the length from the top of the apex of the arch down to the point at which the arch started to move away. So I've cut this to match that in that point, okay?
Go ahead. I was trying to get you a microphone.
Yeah. So this is a template that thank you. This is a template that would be built, or would be made to match the arch that they want to construct. It would be not exactly to size, right, but it would be to scale. So they understood that. From there, then they marked so they cut it to that length. Then they took this rope and they developed that if you would make this thing go into thirds, okay? So they would fold this rope so it made it into thirds, like that. They'd mark the two spots, maybe with colored chalk or something like that, because they didn't have magic marker at the time. They'd mark it right at those spots, and then they'd put the thing back on, realign it, and they'd mark the point where that black mark or that colored chalk made a mark. So here and here, okay? Then they took a string that they cut, or a rope or whatever, that they cut to this length, right? So I'm going to cut this now. And by definition, this one is double the length of the other one. But they would come from here, from this point they marked, through here, and then they would double it, which should be this length. And they'd go through those 2 points. And they would see the length that this came to. This point down here, when it went through those 2 points, that's how wide they made the wall. That's how wide they decided to make the wall. So over here, coming from there down to here, they come to here. If they made the wall as long as this one is, it would collapse and tumble. If they made it out to here and brought it down, the thickness of the wall, the rest of the way down, it would work. I'm good now. Thank you.
He's good now. Before this, you weren't good?
Wasn't good until then. So that was their development, and there's not really the math involved or the concepts or, there's geometry or conceptual things, but that's how they decided to make the walls at that time, and that was those walls that were made that way. And then they would tend to maybe adjust it if they knew that this stone was a little bit less solid than other stone they'd used in the past. Maybe they'd add a few inches onto it. Or if they thought that this was really the best stone they ever worked on, they could push it a little bit and make it a few inches narrower and so on. So they used rule of thumb and trial and error and all these different things. And they developed what it would make. And you can go to almost any Gothic cathedral and do these measurements, and you come out with these results. And they've been written down and kept for time to understand that this is how they did it in those days. So that's, if you go to Paris and you go see Notre Dame, walk about a quarter of a mile and see this beautiful building.
And it didn't need buttresses.
What's that?
It did not need buttresses.
No. What's that? You're talking about some support structures here, huh?
Yeah, they made thick walls.
All right. So that's kind of the development of aspects of how they did it in those days. They didn't have, obviously computers or even, slide rules or anything like that. They didn't even really do the math behind it. They were looking and doing things based on the master mason's knowledge and his plans of how to do it. They didn't have blueprints. They didn't, but he knew what he wanted.
In a sense, it was math, because if you measure those things, it is math, but it's not calculating math on paper, but it is practical math with a piece of string.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and you can imagine, you can translate this concept to building a bridge or something like that. They had a vision in their mind of how the bridge should be, and they got the logs and the things they needed to build a bridge, and they went from that. So it's a development of capacity to build structures that we would have trouble making something similar to today. It's phenomenal. So that's leading to the point that the engineering method is a philosophy of problem solving, which I don't think you'd ever say that's what a scientist's goal is, a scientist's method. And through a bunch of techniques in developing things, some of which we'll talk about in here, this Hammock man I talked about, he comes up with this definition: solving problems using rules of thumb, like I showed you, that cause the best change in a poorly understood situation, also using available resources, right? So some discussions about parts of that, right? Cause the best change. What is best? Why is it a poorly understood situation? And what are available resources? We'll talk a bit about each of those. When you want to talk about the best solution, this is some examples from history. Ancient Egyptian wine pressing. They were able to grow grapes along the Nile Valley, and wine was very important for the ceremonies that they had and things, and this was their method of pressing wine. This was a linen cloth, like they used in many cases for clothes, for wrapping mummies and things like that. And this linen cloth was tied with some knots at the end, put around a frame, and then a loop at this end too, and you can see these people twisting that much too narrow stick. They should have engineered that better. And twisting the linen, right? And you can imagine that works. It's how you wring out clothes, right? Same kind of concept. They even have a hieroglyphic that I didn't put in here. They had 2 men on one side holding a stick, and 2 men on the other side twisting a stick, and then they had a 5th guy balancing between the 2 sticks to push them apart, because the first thing that wants to happen is that these things come together, right? So he's in there pushing apart. You can imagine the one stick turning, and he's got to be probably the pretty adept kind of guy, right? He'd be in Cirque du Soleil nowadays, but stepping around and keeping him from twisting while they're twisting the wine. So he was pushing these things apart. So you can see that they have a pretty good practice, probably got quite a bit of the grapes smashed well in there, right? It used their common resource at the time because they had cotton, could make linen, all their clothes and things, so they used that. A minimum of wood, because wood wasn't as prevalent there, but that was their method to press wine. This over here is called a tapiti from the Arawaks, which were one of the most widely spread out South American tribes. And this was a manioc press. Manioc was a tuber, a root tuber that grew very plentifully there. It lasted long. It had good energy for them. You know the one problem with manioc? Anyone? It has cyanide in the water, in the sap or whatever that comes out of it. So they had to squeeze the sap out of this manioc to make, and then they make flour out of it for their purposes, make bread and so on too. So you've probably seen something like this. Maybe when you were a kid, you had one of these Chinese finger traps, right? And this is a pleated, is it made with linen, cotton? No. It's made with the plants that were available to them at the time, right? They could strip the plants and take plants and make this into this pleated pattern. And it again had a loop at the top that was, you can see how it's engineered to be stronger at that area. And you could pour the manioc in here. It had another root at the bottom. I kind of wanted to show that, so I cut it off. But it had another, it was fully closed at the bottom, but then it had another twisting kind of thing there. So they'd pour the manioc pieces into there, and they'd have a very similar type of thing. Again, 2 sticks between two trees or something like that, and they'd twist it and tie it, move it and move it and move it, and squeeze the material out of there that they didn't like. So that was there. Which one's better? It's almost a funny question, right? It's, what's that? The one that's proper for your environment, uses materials that are available to you, like the linen here and the tree twines here. Okay. Yeah, the thing that's most proper sized for what you want to do, how you want to get things. It's not a best kind of situation. An engineer is not looking for best the way that maybe there's a universal law of gravitation or a universal way of looking at electricity or something like that too, right? That you could bring to a whole other place and tell other people how to use electricity to pump water out of the ground or whatever. So these are engineers that are coming up with solutions for them. Here's an engineering issue. That was the Francis Scott Key Bridge collapse. The container ship called the Dolly lost control. It breaker blew. They replaced the breaker and another breaker blew, and then they were really out of luck. And they drifted into one of the standards of the bridge, and just crushed it. There it is there. And the whole bridge collapsed because it was tied together as an integral unit, right? If you think of an engineering solution and you see a problem, engineers solve problems, why did this become a problem?
It fell down.
It fell down, right? But you could engineer something that wouldn't fall down maybe, right? Did they do anything like that? Did they forget that boats go under bridges?
One thing, I understand that it was not designed for, oh, sorry. I understand that it was designed at a time when container ships were much smaller, so it was not designed for this kind of potential accident.
Right.
It's separate from what you're implying, which is maybe they could do it in some kind of modular way, so the whole thing wouldn't fall down. It seems like you're implying that as well.
Well, you can have a lot of solutions. Once you see something, a catastrophe, then people can say, and it's always easy, and maybe politicians are best at it, to find, what's wrong about what happened and what should have been done differently and cast blame here or there or however you do it. You can talk about, is it a bridge problem? Is it a boat problem? Is it a problem with the river itself getting silted in and being shallower? There's a lot of different issues that get complicated in here, right? A circuit breaker problem on the boat, right? Yeah. Comes down to money.
Somebody didn't want to spend the money to make the big bridge stronger. Somebody didn't want to spend the money to get redundant systems on the boat. So in the end, it comes down to poor decision.
He's saying it comes down to money, for those of you at home, that somebody didn't want to spend the money to have redundant systems on the boat. Someone didn't want to spend money to make the bridge any stronger, all these things. And money comes involved in this a lot of ways. We'll take a couple examples, and you brought up a few good ones. This was in 1964 on the left, the MV Coringa. It was the first real container ship, 63 feet wide, 126 feet long, and it could displace 10,000 tons, okay? This is the Molly. You see it in its day of glory. In 2015, it was built. Once they realized the original ways, and maybe you've seen it on old shows, that they put, they had like the cargo nets, and they'd put a bunch of things in the cargo net and lift it onto the board, and then there'd be guys on the dock loading it up, and guys on board unloading it and putting it away. It cost something like, in those days, in the 60s, $7 a ton to load stuff onto a boat. $7 a ton. With the Dolly, it's about 58 cents a ton to put things on a boat. One reason we're getting our radios and TVs and different things, phones, iPhones from China, all those things for so cheap is that they come over here in enormous container ships like this, right? That they don't have to pay those higher rates for shipping. So you can get these things, each of these is 20 feet long, and then they've made double ones, 40 feet long, that go on the back of trucks right off here. They load them on a truck, and a truck drives them off. Imagine how many, trucks have to be sitting there waiting to have these loaded onto them to go to places, and that's just one container ship. So this displaced 150,000 tons, 984 feet long, 158 feet wide. And look how it's stacked up. Just amazing when you think of that, huh? So the bridge was built in the 70s, 75, I think, something like that. It wasn't built with this concept at all in mind, right? And they're building bridges now that are taller to let bigger container ships go through. The other things is just the way you construct a bridge. This is one example of things. But then how about protecting a bridge? You can use, these are some terms, bumpers, bollards, islands, tugs. Every container boat could take a tug in, right? Or 2 tugs on each side that would take one in. But what does that do to the cost and the time frame when you say you want another iPhone from China, right? If boats are waiting out there, waiting for tugs to take them under one bridge, and how many bridges are there in America, right? So this is all based on the fact of reducing employees, right? Reducing effort, getting things to shipment as soon as possible, as easily as possible. All comes down to money, okay? So these are some examples. Bumpers are these devices along the side here. Some of these have more than one protection item. Bollards are these steel stand-up units here as well, are bollards. Dolphins are heavily encased concrete, stronger than bollards. Here's some bollards with the dolphins out in front, all to lead these things in and to guide them in as best they can, right? And tugs as well. But anything that you do, takes money, takes time, takes effort, and costs. So that's an engineering challenge. So if we want to apply the engineering mindset, most of these I think we've said today already. There's trial and error, right? We tried this and boy, did that thing collapse. We built this bridge and then it didn't last, right? Maybe it did what we thought it should do, but then people liked this bridge. It saved them so much time, they started taking wagons over it and, wagons heavily loaded and then 2 wagons at a time. And, so you learn how to build a bridge better by trial and error. Or the cathedral collapsed. Building on past knowledge was mentioned too. You take the ideas that seem to have worked and apply them, strengthen them, adjust them, conceptualize them. Trade-offs. Again, like we said earlier, this is a different meaning of best. What's the best way to press wine or to get the poisonous stuff out of manioc? Well, what works for that area and works for that time, right? There's always trade-offs in terms of money and challenges and safety and different things like that too. You might decide that you don't want to do something with a bridge because it's going to cost more money, or you might decide you want to make it differently because 6 construction workers died on that bridge, right? It should be safer. What they're talking about now is making islands, full islands around each bridge pier so that a boat would be stopped by grounding before it even hits the bridge pier. But then what that does is it gives you less room to work in, right? Takes some levels of safety away. There's a trade-off of that too. They're making bridges with wider piers to them too, right? That hopefully help less piers to hit on and so on too. But maybe then people start going through it faster to save some time. So I guess the point is that the engineering method reveals how to think about technology and innovation. It gives you concepts of using all these different ideas and decide what you're going to do. Are you going to come out and make a new pop and make it come out in a spherical container because you'll be able to charge less for your pop because it'll save money? You know, there's some things here that'll help you decide what to do about it. Are you going to start building cathedrals a certain way, or bridges or boats or things like that? You know, and like was said, it's such obviously a trade-off that tends to seem to be a problem-solving solution, right? A trade-off involves problem-solving, whereas science is looking at just what's the best, what's this knowledge that we can gain about something, okay? So that's pretty much what I wanted to talk about. I thought leave it open for any questions or discussion or thoughts about engineering. Maybe some of you with engineering backgrounds want to kind of talk about a trade-off that you're involved with or have been involved with in the past. Bob, you got some, I think, don't you?
I've been involved in a number of accelerators, and essentially you build on what you knew yesterday. I mean, you've got the physics. Essentially, every engineer has to go through at least a year or two of basic chemistry and physics and the science stuff, so you have a well-grounded background on it. And then essentially a lot of the accelerators are trial and error. For example, one of the things that they're working on is ITER, which is the International Thermo. It's the fusion reactor of the future. It's a 300 megawatt plant. And somebody asked me, is that going to work? I said, no, it's not. But the issue gets to be is you've got little tiny experiments going on right now. The potential of fusion working is just so great that you either just say, forget it, we're never going to do it, or this is the next step. And the next step it's not going to work, but you're going to find out what the problems are, and you're going to be able to fix those problems. So it is an orderly method to get there, because the problems are just horrendous to fix with the temperatures and pressures and stuff involved in it. And so that's the kind of science that occurred in the past. This worked, let's build on it a little bit, let's see how it works, let's make improvements. If, in many cases, some things would fall down, or what do we got to do to fix this? FAA spends all their time looking at what went wrong in an accident so it never happens again. And so that's a lot of what really happens, but essentially it is an orderly process that goes forward, and it tries to say what's the improvement. And much of the science programs in the U.S. are focused on far future kinds of things, like the ITER, which is the fusion reactor again. So,
And some of those are somewhat, looking for potential problems. Science maybe is stuff that sees what's happening, and people use whatever science develops to solve the problems that they're coming up with there. Yeah.
I was going to say that it seems to me one of the trade-offs for engineering is time, right? There's always a time pressure to finish a project or something in a certain amount of time, whereas in pure science, you pursue it, and then if it takes longer, it takes longer.
Mm-hmm.
I remember a trip to Egypt I took, and two of the more fascinating things involving engineering in Egypt was the first is the bent pyramid. So they start building the pyramid at a particular angle, and then they realize, oh, that's going to collapse or cave in. It's not going to be sturdy enough. And so right in the middle of building the thing, they changed the angle of the slope of the sides of the pyramid as they were figuring out as they went. And then the other engineering thing that I thought was fascinating was some of the earliest stone structures in Egypt were built with columns, and the columns were deliberately shaped as if they were bundles of reeds. So they had clearly previously built structures with bundles of reeds tied together. And some of the earliest stone structures that they made, they carved the stone to look like bundles of reeds, because that's what worked, right? So that incremental engineering can sometimes be seen in a structure that's changed as it's built.
Nice.
I was also commenting on the buttress and the development of the buttress. One of the things that we saw with that particular cathedral was it was really tall and thin. So the weight of the roof was relatively small in comparison with the rest of the building. As they tried to make it wider, the weight of the roof, go ahead, try to say that, weight of the roof became so large that the walls fell out.
Right.
And this people didn't like that.
Especially the
So they went
workers.
through 3 stages, and one of them is shown in the cathedral, the fluted walls. So the fluted wall gives you extra strength of that particular segment of the wall, and so that was step 2. Step 3 was the buttress, which is just a single protective support, and then of course became the flying buttress, of which there can be many. So were you to go to England and go to the Westminster Abbey, you would see buttress and 2 flying buttresses, because the Abbey is very, very, very wide and in danger of falling in. So they just kept building up the walls so that they were stronger.
Yeah. Yeah, the whole development of the Gothic arch allowed you to make an arch on any height building.
Yeah.
It could make things be higher, and they had to be no wider to just make it be higher. It's pretty interesting topics, too.
If you look back at the Romans, a lot of what they did is they over-engineered. When you don't really understand it completely, you over-engineer it. And there's a bridge, I think it's in Spain, which is a couple thousand years old, and the engineer who built it has a little plaque at the end that says, "I built to last this forever," and it's still standing. It's about 2,000 years old.
Yeah, a lot of those aqueducts, right? They were bringing water from the mountains way away from Rome into Rome, fresh water. And the engineering of that, they still use many of
Yep,
those
some of them are
aqueducts
still in
still
use.
today. I think they took most of the lead pipes out of them, though.
Yeah, yeah.
That's one reason they feel like the Roman Empire didn't succeed, yeah.
But the structure itself is just gorgeous.
Right, yeah, yeah. All right. Well, thanks a lot for coming. I enjoyed doing this, and I really recommend, if you got ideas about this, and he talks, Bill Hammack, the engineer guy, and get on his website. You can get him on YouTube and just type in Bill Hammack. He talks about a lot of different stuff. So, thanks so much.